were Martin Luther and John Calvin. As I said, it had very far-reaching effects on the culture of Europe and the politics of Europe, but also in a wider sense on the culture and politics of all those who followed this breakaway. And I am extremely grateful that Professor Dr. Gury Schneider Ludorff has come all the way from Germany to give this lecture, and it will be something remarkable, especially for the many students I see here, for whom it is a part of their curriculum, but they will have it first-hand from a German scholar instead of the usual textbooks which they study. Dr. Schneider Ludorff is president of the Evangelical Federation and an ecumenical organization of the Evangelical Church in Germany. She has had a distinguished academic career. She studied theology at Frankfurt, Germany, Rome, Italy, and at Heidelberg in Germany. She was assistant to the chair of church history at Friedrich Schiller University in Jena, Germany. And since 2005 to the present, she is chair in church history and history of dogma at the Augustana Divinity School, and I will now try to pronounce this word, in Neunden Dates-Sau, German. So she is going to speak on the Reformation and its effects on
500 years ago. Those events have been celebrated in academic conferences at university, but also in the context of exhibitions in state museums, at concerts and political functions. Because with the impulses Europe received at that time, it would not be possible to imagine or to understand the Europe of today with this cultural expressions and political conventions. In the course of the next 30-40 minutes, I should like to make this clear to you by giving some examples. I have divided my address into 3 chapters. To begin with, I shall speak about the person who was most closely linked in Germany with the beginning of the Reformation. It was Martin Luther. His ideas, which were reflected both in theology and in a program of social reform, operated like a transmission belt, picking up the convictions of the late Middle Ages, thinking them through and formulating them in a new way. In my second chapter, I shall be speaking about the widespread reception of this reform program and present the various support groups and media which contributed to the Reformation's spreading further and further. I shall also give examples of the cultural impulses and changes. In the third chapter, I should like to talk about the consequences of the Reformation, which have affected culture and politics in Europe since the 17th century as a result of the formation of confessional groups which started at the Reformation. These consequences can still be observed today and can help to understand the Europe of today better. In conclusion, I shall attempt to summarize. So I come to the first chapter, Martin Luther's program, the Reform program. What we call the Reformation was a stage in the European history of the 16th century which led to a fundamental change in the basis of society and politics, of culture, and in the foundation of religion. The Reformation in Germany is associated, first of all, with the person of Martin Luther. According to his parents, Luther should have become a lawyer, but following a near-fatal experience during a thunderstorm, he decided to enter a monastery and become a monk. His superiors in the monastery very soon decreed that in addition to his work for the order, he should study theology at the famous University of Erfurt. This meant that Luther was familiar with the late medieval traditions of spirituality of his order and had also studied theology in depth in the university when he was called by the regional prince, Friedrich the Wise, to be professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg. Neither the prince nor the superiors of the order could have imagined that in this way they were appointing a professor who would introduce impulses which, within a few years, would transform not only the universities, but also the European landscape as a whole. On closer examination, however, it is less Luther as a person who should be seen as the guiding force of the Reformation, but rather one of his ideas, which he published prominently in the year 1520 in his first Reform tract, its name, to the Christian nobility for the German nation, concerning the reform of the Christian estate, the so-called nobility tract. This document, as such, reveals a seismographic feeling for the confused situation of that time and must therefore be considered one of Luther's most important writings. Indeed, it must even be described. The population in the 16th century took up the ideas of this nobility tract. Not just the theologians, but precisely also the authorities in the towns, the tradesmen, the writers and men of letters, the middle-class women and men, the Protestant princes and princesses. They were all stimulated by Luther's nobility tract to read the Bible themselves. This was not usual, but now they wanted to read the Bible themselves, to discuss their insights and to implement them with the intention of creating a new social order that was more pleasing to God. This had become possible because Martin Luther has translated the Bible into German. By doing so, he had an amazing success in the cultural field, and as well because the language he used for the translation, the Sächsische Kanzleisprache, the official section language, became the official language in Germany-speaking areas within only in a few years. Prior to that, in Germany, many different dialects had been predominant in Germany and Europe. Another reason for the acceptance of this translation of the Bible and of many other theological writings was we call it media revolution. The media revolution, which has taken place extremely quickly thanks to the invention of book printing for the middle of the 15th century. The newly established printing houses ensured the rapid distribution of the Bible and the Reformation tracts and leaflets throughout Europe. Without this change in the media and the many different people involved, as well as the link between theology, spirituality, and political impulses, the Reformation would have quickly purged out. The rapid spread of Reformation all over the levels of society in Europe was also possible because Luther took up ideas and demands which had already been considered and written down in the late Middle Ages and were urgently awaiting implementation. For example, the princes and the town officials had demanded that the bishops give them the responsibility for the religious welfare of their subjects, for reforming the monasteries, and for the oversights of the preachers. And they had already won certain extensive rights. This had challenged the central claim of the bishops, which had increasingly shifted into the decentralized competence of the princes and the town. In the towns, independent groups and alliances had been formed which read the Bible together and practiced common prayer and other forms of spirituality apart from the monasteries and the church hierarchy in the Middle Ages. In addition, the debates about the true worship of God had become more acute. Which was to be considered more important? An outward spirituality, which was visible in receiving the sacraments and attending worship services, or an inner spirituality with its roots in late medieval mysticism, which wanted to lead people to converse with God daily without mediation of a priest. So, Luther's achievement was that he took up the ideas and areas of tension present in the late Middle Ages, focusing on them and collecting together the vehement criticism of shortcomings in the church and politics. One of these effects were A, the shifting of responsibility for religious affairs from the bishops to the secular authorities caused by the Reformation. That's the next point. A large proportion of the authorities in the towns and some princes in their territories introduced the Reformation. The adoption of the so-called Landesherrliches Kirchenregiment, the religion of the ruler, determined the religion of the subjects, the Landesherrliches Kirchenregiment, was also a decisive development. The reformers referred back to the legal system of episcopal visitation in the Middle Ages and made this instrument for checking on church reforms a duty for the secular authorities. The regional princes became some kind of emergency bishops, were responsible for the jurisdiction in marital affairs, exercises and influence on the appointment of pastors and the administration of ecclesiastical property and finance, the pastors. Second effect was the access of the Bible for everyone and the widespread educational initiatives, the founding of schools and universities. Because according to Luther, Protestant education had to start by reading the Bible. So in his Nobility Tract, Luther recommended, you see it in the paper, above all, I quote, in schools of all kinds, the chief and most common lesson should be the scriptures, and for young boys, the gospel, and would to God each town had also girls' schools, in which girls might be taught the gospel for an hour daily, either in German or in Latin. Should not every Christian be expected by his 9th or 10th year to know all the Holy Gospel? So Luther wrote. So, Protestant education was first and foremost the study of the Bible, familiarity with the Bible, biblical stories which Luther considered central knowledge as guidance for living. By demanding knowledge of the Bible, he launched an extremely rapid educational impetus, also for girls and women. The church was no longer to be charge of the schools as before it was, and religious education, but rather the secular authorities in the towns and territories. The person who drew up the best Reformation conception of education and put it into practice at the level of schools and university with an effect throughout Europe was Martin Luther's colleague, the humanist Philip Melanchthon. For Melanchthon, education was not only necessary for shaping society, but also had a religious motivation. Education is worship of God, he wrote. For Melanchthon and for Luther, the highest principle of education and policy was that everyone had the duty to care for schools. So religious education was an authentic task for truly Christian authorities. As we can see from Melanchthon's first school regulations, the Nürnberger Schulordnung of 1526, Melanchthon set special store by knowledge of the Bible traditions and of the languages, especially Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. In his reform program for the universities, Melanchthon supplemented the 7 liberal arts of the medieval universities, the trivium of language, grammar, grammatic, logic, rhetoric, and the quadrivium of science, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy by adding poetry and history, as Italian humanists had done before him. He also specified that the knowledge of Greek was indispensable for being able to study. In this way, he introduced the humanist classical education, the main feature of which were to sensitize scholars to other contexts, following the examples of classical education, and to equip them with broad linguistic competence. With the help of humanist education and awareness of the historical genesis of European culture was to be promoted, and thus as a transfer of culture through the centuries was to benefit the Reformation. This is also the reason why Melanchthon's educational program was so widely received in Europe. Without some form of institutionalization, Luther and Melanchthon's educational impulses would have certainly have vanished in the sand. And therefore, it is very fortunate that the secular authorities were interested in the new conception of education. The towns in particular, but also the Protestant princes who supported the Reformation in connection with territorial government, began to develop new educational structures. One of these princes, whose part was absolutely central in the future in the reformers' education impulses, was Philip von Hessen. Because he, in the year 1527, he had founded the University of Marburg in Hessen, the first Protestant university. It was a new idea of introducing an education system throughout the whole territory, for an education for the higher education and for a general education. And this was introduced in this with the university. Then he established a pedagogium as a bridge between the Latin schools and the university, and then in the course of time, by setting up schools everywhere in the small towns and villages, also schools for women. Third effect was that the Reformation and its consequences for literature, art, music, and architecture. First the Bible, then the education, and then spread also the importance for the noble woman, Agula von Krumbach, a Bavarian woman, took up her pen in the dispute with the University of Ingolstadt in favor for representatives and concerns of the Reformation. And the hymn writer Elisabeth Kreuziger published her hymn book in 1524 and contributed in this way to spreading the impulses of the Reformation. Lazarus Spengler, the town clerk of Nuremberg, drew up the first Reformation alm regulation in 1522. According to the new teaching, he recognized as good works only foundations and donations that served the poor people. These works alone were to be praised as fruits of the faith. Pictures and works of the art, which were to strengthen the faith according to the new teaching, also served to honor God and benefit the people. This meant that donors, families in the towns, tradespeople, and artists could be recognized as responsible for the Reformation, since if they did not only witness to their faith through works of art, but also provided comforting pictures for the faithful to see. As a result of a playful system of donations, not only art, but also music enjoyed a new stimulus and, in the following centuries, produced diversity and wealth of styles of art, music and architecture, which belong today to the inheritance that gives Europa an identity. In the Lutheran invention of cuius regio eius religio, with the ruler of the territory as also the emergency bishop, continued to be effective up to the 20th century in Germany, and also in the European countries within adopting the Reformation. In the Protestant territories following the Reformation and into the 18th century, church affairs were placed under the responsibility of the territorial rulers, and the consistories subject to them, which functions as ecclesiastical, regional, state, and administrative organs. In the religious peace of Augsburg of the year 1555, it was established that the religion of the territorial ruler determined the religion of his subjects. Only when the monarchy came to an end after the First World War in 1980, this also put an end for the Protestant churches in Germany to the system of this cuius regio eius religio, effectively brought about by the Reformation, and to the end of this close link between throne and altar. But the constitution in the Weimar democracy, constitution, the state emphasized its neutrality in relation to the religious issues. But the constitution guaranteed certain religious communities the status of cooperation under public law with self-determination within the legislative framework and the privilege to collect taxes from their members. I come to the point 3, to the chapter 3, other cultural and political consequences of the Reformation in Europe resulting from the development of different denominations. However, the towns and princes did not all support Luther and his ideas. The result was that from 1525 onwards, Europe was divided into territories with different denominations, and which became increasingly estranged from one another. Initially, the territories faithful to the Pope, which called themselves the Old Believers, and maintained the old faith as did Emperor Charles V at the level of the empire, were divided from those which had adopted the new teaching, inspired by theologians and such as Luther. A few years later in Switzerland, with theologian Calvin, as its main initiator, an additional form of the Reformation took shape, Europe, and mention could be made also of the introduction of the Reformation in England as well, another form of Reformation. Therefore, the further political effects of the Reformation in the following centuries included the split of different denominations, which argued about the true doctrine and repeatedly waged war against one to another. Certainly, religious convictions played an important part, but also the struggle for political power. At the same time, the denominations accentuated their differences, competing to gain ground with their specific features, and this encouraged the present diversity of art and culture in Europe. For Lutheranism, the emphasis on consistent knowledge of the Bible and on verifying the precepts of the faith by referring to the Bible, as well as a strong emphasis on education, became central and are still distinguishing features of Protestant culture and socialization today. The Catholic institutional approach led to a reorganization of the Papal Catholic Church, which designed its own religious practice and education anew, separately from the Protestant territories. Here, the main emphasis was on sensuous perception, which took form in the Baroque architecture and style of art, as well as in music. In this way, in the Catholic Church, it was to be possible to perceive divine grace on earth. Attending organ concerts and theater productions with a religious content became the epitome to the middle-class spirituality. The cultural and political implications of the Reformed theology of the Switzerland theology of the Calvinistic origin, with its strict prohibitions of images, encouraged a live religiosity, a disciplined style of life, and a political theory. So we have different forms of denomination that you can still be recognized in Europe today. In such a multi-confessional setting, they have repeatedly had to compete and engage in mutual interchange. In addition, the experience of dealing with differences, different confessions, different denominations, forms the basic of the political culture in Europe today. Considering the almost insoluble structural intolerance which the confessions originally developed and then cultivated for centuries, overcoming it must be seen as an achievement. A start was made in Germany already in the 16th century, but then it took more time for today, but coming to this form today. The Peace of Augsburg did not constitute the first step towards religious liberty in general, but extending the prohibition of feuds to cover the religious realm in 1555 and the establishment of an order of peace between the confessions were of special importance for the later development of the religious liberty of the individual. The historian Burckhardt, the historian called Burckhardt, has underlined this and drawn the conclusion, I quote, "This is good reason to believe that the compulsion of tolerance that came about in the confessional realm of religion should also be taken into account politically applied to the other realms of politics, society and life, and that is thus become a culture skill of Europe and its better moments. What could be called a cultural skill of Europe? I have three short answers. Cultural skills of Europe. Firstly, the Europe people quite simply learned to live together. Over a long period, this could definitely not have been taken for granted. Even through the individual confessions saw themselves as the sole representatives of the real few, they had to learn that they could neither convert nor destroy each other. It was necessary to keep the peace. Second, they had to get to know one another better and to acquire knowledge, the common points and the differences. This applied both to religious convictions and cultural characteristics, as well as to mutual relations in the social and the political realm. To this end, a comprehensive education was required. The establishment of schools for girls and boys in the villages, as well as higher education and university studies, served the interest of all confessions. Thus, the universities and the colleges founded in Europe in the 16th and 17th century, which were originally linked to the confessions, formed the basic for the broad range of academic education in Europe today. Third, it was only after a long process that this struggle for freedom contributed to promoting the idea of tolerance and its acceptance in both the political and the religious realm. This was the basis for the state legislation on churches in Germany today, and for the various legal provisions of the European states relating to religious communities, which guarantee and protect the peaceful exercise of religion and the peaceful coexistence of religion in Europe. These matters are ordered differently in different European countries. I now come back to the situation in Germany. Again, in Germany, for example, there is no state church like in England or Scandinavia, but the Christian churches and the Jewish religious communities are corporations under public law, and at the present there is a discussion about whether this could also be applied to some Muslim associations in Germany. This means that religion and the state are separated institutions, but the state protects the religious communities under the basic law, and he also collects the taxes for the church. It guarantees religious education in state schools, the study of theology at state universities, and also the religious holidays. The churches and religious communities, for their part, are active in the democracy through their social service institutions and also in ethical debates to promote the value of solidarity and mutual welfare. In conclusion, I shall now summarize and come to the end. Among the effects of the Reformation on culture and politics in Europe, we can firstly, the unification of the German language in the 16th century. Secondly, the adoption of religious education for individuals by means of general access to the Bible and then more things. Thirdly, the initiative for education on a broad scale and its establishment of schools and universities. Fourthly, the impulses of a new for new styles in art, architecture, and music. With it is impossible to understand how Europe sees itself. Fifthly, one must mention that after a long struggle for peace between the different denominations, a conception of tolerance gained acceptance, which has been implemented in the European legal system and thus guarantees the equal rights and peaceful coexistence of the religions and confessions, denominations today. At the same time, mention must be made of the relation between religion and politics, which can be described as an independent counterparts which a view to mutual support for the well-being of society and an emphasis on their mutual duty and commitment to work for a peaceful and a just society in Europe, which had been destroyed in the 20th century by the disaster of the 2 world wars. Thank you for your attention. Who brings those both things together, Columbus and the Reformation. And it's just this world in this time, it's like a breaking world, an extending world. Yeah, it's not only the Reformation in Europe, but also, yes, it's like a time where so many new inventions came together, and also the humanistic and the technique and the media revolution, and going to the other countries. So we can't tell why it was like this, but we can tell that it was like this. It came all together. But the second point, I think it's very important. Why did the values of the Reformation not come into the come into the colonies? Yes, it's very. Perhaps it's like you said. You have to do with people who you want to be like gods also, and perhaps this was, I don't know. It's a strong heritage for us. But it's the Reformation of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church saw that the Protestant Church had this all new education forms and the Reformation of the Church and so on and so on. And the Catholic Church also had reacted like this to reform their own traditions and their own institutions. And this was very important for the Catholic Church. Also the Jesuits, I don't know if the Jesuits, the order of Jesuits, they implemented very, very important schools and universities in Europe of the Catholic side. And so it was very important, this counter-reformation for the Catholic Church to renew their traditions in their territories. Yes, in some territories the Reformation had to be all. But in the territories of the Catholic territories, the Counter-Reformation was also a renewing of the Catholic Church. The witches.
Then what about the poor witches?
The poor witches, yes. It's like this that my students all think that the Middle Ages, was very dark, and in the Middle Ages the witches were tortured and killed. It was not the Middle Ages. It was indeed the time after Reformation. In this time,
Modern age. Early modern period.
the modern age, and in both denominations, and the Catholic, all three, the Catholic and the Protestant and in the Reformed territories, witches were persecuted, women were persecuted as witches. This is, I think, a very cruel a form, and I can't really explain. I only can say that in this time where the war between all the denominations, the religious denominations, this was also an effect that for the women it was a problem. It was the new age was not a new. You should also have the other parts. You have a new idea, but you also have the cruel things against women. Yeah. And the last witch was burned in the 18th century. Women as witch in the 18th century. The women as witch. And in the 18th century, in the time of the Enlightenment, as we call Enlightenment.
So we have all these contradictions, the contradictions of history. Professor Schneider Ludorff, I want to thank you. As you see, you had a full house, and I'm very happy that there were so many young people here today, because I think part of this is part of their curriculum also. They study the Reformation. But there's so many issues have been raised with respect to the effect of the Reformation, which has not been passed on to other people and to the colonized people. And in fact, I don't know, somebody said, or you said maybe, that you're bringing Europe together, but from what I see, I think Europe is not coming together at all. There are so many parts of Europe which are falling out. Look at what has happened in Catalonia. And so I think that these are cycles of history: integration, disintegration, integration, disintegration. I want to thank you on behalf of our institute and all our members and all our guests, for not only was your presentation coherent and wide-ranging, but I think the charming way in which you delivered your talk was also very, very effective. We have